Well, hello everyone. Good morning. It's a real pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to be speaking a little bit off topic from my normal research today. I'm going to be talking about three things in particular over the next 40 odd minutes that Shanaz has asked me to speak for, and hopefully it'll be fairly self-evident the three things that I am going to talk about. I'm going to be talking about Smith, probably intermittently. I'm going to be talking about the British East India Company rather more. And I'm going to be talking about me as well. I'm going to give you some insights into my life and the way that I live that to try to help you understand the way in which all of us, in one way or another, are likely to be have some sort of relationship, historically speaking anyway, to the British Empire. I'm not a raging egomaniac, honestly, so if you are worried that there looks as though there's going to be double me from the title of my talk, it's not going to be all that bad. I will talk about me in two distinct ways. Firstly, I want to talk about me illustratively. So I want to use some aspects of my family history as a means of trying to open up a number of questions about the way that empire continues to reverberate through the generations. I'm fascinated by the way that my family, a very ordinary family, of respectable working class people were part of the British Empire and part of the reproduction of the British Empire. I will also talk about me apologetically. And the thing that I always have to apologise for when I'm asked to talk about the British Empire is how little I know about it, how little that comes across my consciousness from what I was taught when I was at school counted as British history. So one of the things that I'm going to do is be very honest with you this morning and to point out a number of areas of ignorance. Ignorance of my own history, personally, ignorance of my own country's history as well. You might think it's strange to come to university and listen to a professor announce his ignorance, but that's, as you will find out, is exactly what I struggle from in this regard. I hope, though, that by letting you into some of those secrets about my own ignorance, that will help you to challenge what might be your ignorance as well about the way that the British Empire continues to ripple down through the generations. We might think that the British Empire is something of only historical value. We might think that it's something that's over and done with, but the way that you live your lives today are in many ways still shaped by the legacies of British Empire. And that's why we're calling the project the Colonial Hangover. We want to try to understand the way that those legacies persist, the way that they feed down through the generations, the way that through our actions today, as conscious political agents, we might be able to challenge some of those legacies. And certainly we might be able to bring to light some of the continuing inequities that are the historical product of empire. This may be an obvious question to ask straight away. Why is it that someone like me, somebody who has the great good fortune of working in a university, who gets some time to sit and think about the nature of the world, who works in a politics department, so actually I'm required to spend my time thinking about the nature of the world. How is it that someone like me can be increasingly consumed about the fact that there's this big gap in my knowledge? And the big gap in my knowledge is about the history of British Empire. So I've been socialised as a British citizen to know certain things about British history, but one of the biggest stories that you can tell about British history is precisely about empire. And this is one of the things that I find, even though I'm a professional academic, I find that that's missing from my own self-knowledge. But let me lay my cards on the table immediately where I come to on the question of empire. Ever since I was your age, or younger even, I've been involved in political campaigns that seek to ask a number of challenging questions about empire. Political campaigns that ask whether our politicians today should take seriously the question of what a proper structure, an appropriate structure of reparations would look like. How does Britain pay back the debt that it's accumulated to other countries in appropriating those countries' lands, those countries' resources, those countries' people, and building them into an empire from which Britain was the main beneficiary? I've also been involved in political campaigns since I was your age or even younger that asked the questions about historical apologies, whether it would be right for British politicians today to apologise for the historical atrocities that were undertaken in the name of empire. Here's somebody that you will recognise, although not quite in the clothes that you would usually see in him. There he is, as you would be more likely to see him. This is David Cameron. In 2013, he made a visit to the Golden Temple at Amritsar in India. He was the first British Prime Minister to have been invited to visit the Golden Temple since 1919, when a number of British soldiers working on behalf of the Imperial British Army opened fire indiscriminately on crowds at the temple, massacring many hundreds of local Indian civilians. A lot of the press coverage around Cameron's visit was over the question of whether he would apologise, for the actions of those soldiers on that day almost 100 years ago. And his press office was ambivalent as to whether we should expect an apology. And it was only when he was there that he announced that he was not going to apologise, that he saw that this was an historical event and historical event should be left there, that there was no need to apologise. He said that it is, and I quote, wrong to reach back into history. It is wrong, he said, to reach back into history and to think of the legacies that the historical actions of Britain and of British people have left within the world. Well, that's the complete antithesis of what we are intending to do on the Colonial Hangover project. We want you to do precisely that. We want you to reach back into history. We want you to reach back into the country's history. We want you to reach back into your personal history as well, to try to understand those mechanisms through which ordinary people were involved in the day-to-day reproduction of imperial relationships. But back to my original question, because I've still not got anywhere near answering that. Why is it that I keep coming back to this issue of this big hole in my knowledge? Well, the easiest and most obvious answer is to blame it on my schooling. And that, of course, is not the same as blaming it on either my school or my teachers. I enjoyed my time at school. I thought my history teachers were very good and very interesting. But to focus on the issue of schooling rather than the issue of the school asks you to question who it is that gets to decide what you're taught. Now, your teachers are not in charge of what you are taught. They might very well be in charge of the way that you're taught it, but they also have to have at least one mind onto what you will be formally examined on at the end of your programmes. And what you're formally examined on at the end of your programmes is governed by the national curriculum. Here is the national curriculum in history that was developed in 2013. And the people that are really important in this regard are government ministers, people working for the Department for Education. Now, what I remember from the history curriculum I studied at school in the 1980s was how partial it was. And that's partial in both senses of the word. It's partial in the sense that it created a rather partisan history of Britain. It was a history that almost led to national cheerleading, that it focused on all those things that apparently Britain did very well, and only all those things that Britain did very well. So it was also partial in the other sense of how much it left out. If you can imagine what the whole of British history might look like from a whole variety of perspectives, what I remember being taught at school covered only a very tiny proportion of those. We might also try to politicise this to argue that it was a whitewashed form of history. And I use the word whitewashed in both senses as well. Firstly, the partial history, the small bit of the overall British history that was focused on, emphasised all those nice fluffy things that were meant to make young Britons feel good about their country's history. So all those difficult questions, all those challenging questions, all those moments where we might be queasy at the thought of what our forefathers had done, all those moments where we might be embarrassed of the legacy of British Empire, these were entirely erased from the curriculum that I studied. So it might be that this was a curriculum that was whitewashed in another completely different sense. suggesting that the only view of empire that's valid is the view from the white English colonial settler. And that's really a rather disturbing thought if, on these massive questions of world history, you only are given a single viewpoint from which to understand the relationships undertaken with empire. Looking back, the curriculum made it seem as though Britain, a tiny island home to less than 1% of the global population, was responsible for 99% of all the good things that had ever happened within the world. So if you can imagine any step increase in the lot of humankind, there was a Britain behind there somewhere. Now, this might be a very fluffy way of thinking about history, and it might be a very comforting way of thinking about history if you are always on the side of the angels. But really? Can we not think that history might have many different perspectives to it? That you can understand history from very many different angles? Was there really no downside to Britain's place in world history that it might not even be worthwhile to mention within the school curriculum? The school curriculum I studied in the 1980s suggested that it wasn't. I was really worried about this even at the time. Is it right that we shelter the country's teenagers from the idea that they might choose to be critical of British leaders' decisions, whether in the present or in the past? I found it patronising to me and my generation in the 1980s that we weren't allowed to have that all-round view of what the British Empire was all about. So we couldn't make decisions on our own about whether this was a good or a bad thing. And I think it's equally patronising to you also today if the people in the Department for Education are trying to develop a national curriculum in history that doesn't allow you also to challenge the notion of the British Empire. And I've been increasingly thinking along these lines again in recent years because of this man. I'm sure you will recognise him. Until last week, he was one of the more interesting people in British politics because of whether or not he'd broken all Privy Council rules and leaked private conversations that he'd heard the Queen having to the Sun newspaper. Of course, he is the great beneficiary of Ian Duncan Smith's resignation, because now nobody's talking about him and whether Cameron's going to have to sack him for breaking all these Privy Council rules, because this is Michael Gove, of course, another one of the leading anti-Europeans in the cabinet, and someone that Cameron now has to keep on board, given that he's already lost Ian Duncan Smith from his cabinet, who will become even more involved, one would think, in the Brexit campaign. But this is Michael Gove, who I'm interested in here through his tenure as Secretary of State for Education back in the early days of the Cameron government. Back in 2010, he instructed civil servants to devise a new national history curriculum around what he called an island story of Britain that would both chart and celebrate British achievements. He wanted a positive spin being put on history. But he wasn't the first person who's thought of developing an island story. Here's a book by Henrietta Elizabeth Marshall from all the way back in 1905 called, guess what? Our Island Story, a history of England for boys and girls, it suggests. So had you been around in 1905, this is what you would have been reading. This is what you would have been studying from, a history of England for boys and girls. But note the time, 1905. The British Empire was still just about at its height. And this was a particular history that Marshall was trying to present to the teenagers of Britain back in 1905. This was about celebrating empire. This was about more than that. It was about socialising the youth of Britain into becoming the next imperial citizens, to try to win people over to the notion of empire so that they would then go out as colonial servants wherever it was in the world that Britons were stationed and become the next administrators of the British Empire. So there's a real political dialogue underpinning the supposedly historical narrative of the island story. And this was something that Gove was wanting to recreate. It's quite easy to ridicule it, though. It's ripe for ribbing. Here's a cover from the New Statesman magazine talking about Gove's attempts to reinvigorate an island story. that it could be told around one or two Great Britons, invariably white people, and the Queen aside, invariably men as well. These people who you can tell this lion-hearted story about Britain and the Empire around. I've also come across a London Review of Books article by the historian Richard Evans from 2011 that I think sums up the notion of Gove's national curriculum history the best. This essay was entitled "The Wonderfulness of Us." And that's what Gove wanted the national curriculum to say. How wonderful we are, how wonderful Britain is, and how much the rest of the world has to thank Britain for. Now, if you're living in a former colonial country and all you know about Britain is the stories of terror, the stories of brutality, the stories of bloodshed through which the British Empire was maintained within your country, then you might not think that you have a great deal to thank Britain for historically. But not according to Gove and the new national curriculum. Gove was particularly critical of academic historians. He thought that academic historians were guilty of being anti-patriotic. They were guilty of trying to provide all sides to the story of British Empire. They were guilty of creating negativity, that fostering in you, the next generation of British citizens, some desire to question whether the British Empire was right. Terrible, 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 said Gove, all this negativity. What we need is a positive story of British Empire, to understand the legacy of British Empire through a particular perspective, where we can begin to celebrate the legacy that Britain had left for the world. So in order to create this positive story, he went out and found two historians, two famous right-wing historians, who are pretty much the only ones known for continuing to play the pro-empire card. Andrew Roberts here, Niall Ferguson there. These were the people that he tried to get to act as his advisors to develop a purely positive curriculum on the British Empire. Nothing else other than celebration of British achievements in the world would be officially tolerated. Now, all of this might be very convenient for the Prime Minister, as I go back to the idea of personal histories and family histories and how important they are to linking us today to the past of the British Empire. And that might lessen the embarrassment he surely feels when he meets other Commonwealth heads of state who ask him about the reparations issue. And lots of Commonwealth heads of state do ask him precisely that, a question that he tries to fend off as best he can. Look at the very, very squeamish body language going on in this photograph. This is David Cameron with the former Prime Minister of Jamaica, Portia Simpson Miller. And Portia Simpson Miller was very keen, every time she met David Cameron at Commonwealth Heads of State meetings, to ask him about the reparations issue. There is a very strong reparations campaign within Jamaica and also within Jamaican communities in Britain as well, asking serious consideration be made to the idea that the slave trade that was centred for Britain on Jamaica, with all of the sugar plantations that were managed through slave labour, that is an historical wrong that can only be righted through significant financial recompense. This is a question that Cameron tries to dodge whenever he can. And there might be a good reason for that, going back into his family history. Now, you'll probably know that the House of Commons abolished British involvement in the slave trade in 1807. And there's a copy of the Act from that year. This was presented in Gove's curriculum as an enlightened act of the British doing the jolly decent thing of abolishing the slave trade. This was the sense of fair play that good upper-class Britons had learnt on the playing fields of Eton, or maybe playing cricket somewhere or other, wherever it was. And that fair play should be extended to other people in the world. So maybe you had to really try to do away with the slave trade. That's what Gove's national curriculum would have had you believe. Not asking why the institution of slavery existed in the first place, not trying to connect the institution of slavery to the way that Britain tried to enrich itself within the world in the 17th and 18th century, and certainly not asking who specifically benefited from that enrichment. Because one of the issues about reparations that gets very little airplay is this. There were reparations that took place after the 1807 abolition of the slave trade, but they are not the reparations that are asked for by Portia Simpson Miller or any other politicians from former colonial countries. The British government chose not to make reparation payments to its colonies through which the slaves had been trafficked, and it certainly didn't choose to make any direct reparations to newly freed slaves. However, it did find some money, a lot of money, massive money bags to make financial recompense to those British families who had benefited handsomely from their involvement in the slave trade. A huge amount of money. Until the recent banking crisis persuaded the British government to pretty much sign blank cheques to bail out all of the banks. The financial reparations that the British government made in 1807 to former slave owners and former slave traders from this country is the single biggest transfer of money from the state to private individuals in this country ever. £16.5 billion worth in today's terms. £16.5 billion worth. I seem to think that if I keep repeating that figure over and over again, you'll have a sense of how big it is, but let me try to give you an example of how big it is. Think back to the last week, all of the political controversy over the removal of the personal independent payments. This would have saved £1.4 billion worth from the budget. And yet the payment that was made to former British slave owners and former British slave traders was 15 times the size of the amount of money that we're talking about with personal independent payments. Moreover, personal independent payments, did I get that right? Personal independent payments are being paid to 2/3 of a million people. 2/3 of a million people share that £1.4 billion. The financial recompense that went to the ex-slave traders and the ex-slave owners from Britain was shared amongst only a couple of thousand people. So £16.5 billion shared between a couple of thousand people. By the mid-Victorian era, around a fifth of all wealthy Victorian families owed their fortunes in some way to the legacies of the slave economy and to that financial payment that was made in 1807. And yes, David Cameron's family was one of them. So no wonder he looks a bit shifty when world leaders ask him about reparations for the British involvement in the slave trade, because his family were directly involved in that and did benefit handsomely from the reparations that the British government did make for ending the slave trade. And just in case any of you work in your part-time as David Cameron's libel lawyers, here's the link to the article with all the figures, and so I pass all responsibility for what I've just said over to that article. Now then, thankfully, the Gove plan was not implemented in full. He had to backtrack under pressure from many campaign groups in this country, and in particular from the Royal Historical Society. He would have had your history curriculum look very much like the one that I studied at school, and thankfully that wasn't the case. There has been a change over the last 30 years since I was your age in what is taught as British history at school. No longer I'm led to believe, do you get what I got when I was at school, which was lots and lots of focus on all of those battles, all of those wars that the British think they won, and absolutely no mention at all of all those wars that other countries think that they won against Britain. So that was what history was for me when I was at school. And it might be that one or two of you sitting there wondering where this was that I went to school. And here's the answer. I went to Sir John Talbot's Comprehensive School in Whitchurch in North Shropshire. Interestingly, given the content of my lecture today, the school had a really rather intimate connection with the British Empire that I was completely unaware of at the time. So another aspect of my ignorance. Not only was I ignorant about the British Empire because of what the national curriculum allowed me to be taught when I went to that school, but the school itself also had a connection to the British Empire. Let me try to explain. Now, our school was divided into three houses. all of which were named after local Shropshire heroes. I was in the Yellow House, and the Yellow House was called Bridgewater, named after Francis Egerton, the third Duke of Bridgewater, who was a philanthropist heavily involved in canal building projects in North Shropshire. Hooray for Bridgewater. The Orange House was called Darwin. It was named after Charles Darwin, the naturalist, best known of course for his theory of evolution and the origin of species, who was schooled in Shrewsbury. The Greenhouse, Clive, was named after Robert Clive, usually known as Clive of India. And here's a Hollywood depiction of Clive of India in the 1930s when he was played by Ronald Colman, an upper-class English gent characterising on film another upper-class English gent. And look at him with his suave look and his matinee idol appearance, and clearly he has a better taste in facial hair than I do at the moment. Look at that pencil moustache. Isn't that a thing of absolute wonder? Clive of India, however, had a rather different side. Clive came to prominence when being generally credited with having driven out other European East India companies from South Asia in the 1750s, because it was only at that point that Britain was able to claim the whole of the territory of India as its single colonial possession. It was Clive's defeat of the French East India Company in 1757 at the Battle of Plassey that was particularly important in this regard. And note the flag that the British soldiers are fighting under. It isn't the British flag. This is the flag of the British East India Company. It's the company, not the country, that were the initial colonists within India. For 101 years, until the House of Commons passed the Government of India Act in 1858, the whole of South Asia was ruled in effect by a multinational corporation. The British East India Company was the sovereign entity within the whole of South Asia. Let's have a think about this, because this is a territory who on today's population is comprised of 1.65 billion people, and yet it was governed in effect by a single company. Some historians have talked about a company state, a company that becomes the state, that it sets up all of the structures of a state, but it's managed and regulated and governed as a company would be. This is largely unthinkable today, isn't it? Well, we would hope so anyway. Now, there might be some multinational corporations that you are all too wedded to in the way that you engage with social media and the like. But nonetheless, surely we've seen nothing quite like this. The idea that a company can govern a whole population that in today's term is 1.65 billion people. The British East India Company devised for itself the powers to make laws. It also claimed for itself the powers to punish, the power to discipline, the power to set life chances in the way that it saw best. It attempted to enforce obedience. It was able to do this because it claimed the sovereign power to be its own judge and jury. So what it decided was the appropriate way of acting was the way that it acted. Very, very little oversight. It also tried to manipulate consent amongst the locals for the way that it was governing within India. And Clive was at the centre of all of this. Clive, the person who one of the houses in my school was named after, was right at the centre of all of this. He graduated from errant schoolboy who his biographers say was driven to persecute others through his own snobbish sense of entitlement, to a junior accounts clerk at the British East India Company. His dad had sent him off there thinking that this might instill a bit of discipline into him. He then went from there, graduating from junior accounts clerk into the British East India Army, to the point at which he became the head of the British East India Army, to the point at which, after successive victories in battle against other European East India Company armies, he ruled a massively, massively densely populated company as a single sovereign. He was, in many ways, a despotic leader. And like all despotic leaders, he required local worthies and local dignitaries to come to him and pay homage, which they did through offering him various sorts of gifts. Here's a famous painting by a founder member of the Royal Academy, Francis Hayman. And one of the things that we're interested in on the Colonial Hangover project is the way that images of British Empire have been incorporated into various art forms. Now, portrait painting was a particular favourite of people through the 18th and 19th centuries. And so what you will find as we run through a lot of this with you is how much portraiture was involved in sending out or sending back to Britain these rather safe, comforting images of British Empire. Look at the way that Clive, this is Clive just here, look at the way that he's given some sort of regal pose as if he's a legitimate authority because of that. And look at the way it seems as though he's developing willing subjects from amongst the local population. Now, Hayman's picture shows homage being paid to Clive by the Mir Jaffa. Now, Mir Jaffa was installed by Clive as the first Nawab of Bengal. This was an honorary position under the protection of the British East India Company. For showing his allegiance to the British East India Company, the Mir Jaffa was given any number of privileges to run Bengal or aspects of Bengal in the way that he saw fit. This was how a structure of consent was developed, knowing that there would always be force in the background if consent wasn't given, inviting people to pay homage, to give gifts, to subject themselves to British rule. This is one of those strange invitations where you don't really seem to have the right to say no. It's not quite like the invitation that you had today from Shanaz to come to Warwick to listen to us talk about the Colonial Hangover. It's more like the invitation that you have to sit your exams at the end of your A-level courses. You can't really say no to sitting your exams at the end of your A-level courses. You could, of course, have not bothered coming today. So it's an invitation that you couldn't say no to. But of course, artwork can take many different forms. Here's one that really shouldn't count as artwork because I'm in it. Here's a photograph of me in the main market square of Shrewsbury, where a statue of Robert Clive still stands. This is me, I hasten to add, conspicuously not paying homage to Clive, who I consider a vulgarian and a war criminal. You can probably see that I've got a bit of a glum look on my face and an awkward pose. And that was deliberate, really, to show that I am there standing next to this statue, but in no way do I honour any of the things that he achieved. It's little consolation to me that Clive's biographers report his overwhelming sense of disappointment when he returned home to Britain after his spell in India and not being feted as a national hero. In general, he was just ignored. The local population shunned him. Clive thought in his own mind that he would return in the same way that Nelson and Wellington did, that he would be this conquering hero. He would have stamps made of him. He would have coins made of him. Everywhere that he would go, there would be local collections to raise statues of him. I think I might be right in saying that this is one of the only ones that exists, and this exists in a town that he used to live in. Now, Gos' national curriculum would also have told you that Clive's life should be celebrated, as he was personally responsible for bringing stability to a South Asian empire that Britain ruled over for nearly 2 centuries. However, I join with Gos' critics from the Royal Historical Society in saying that we should be embarrassed about the way in which British elites ruthlessly exploited a whole continent's people in the search for riches and grandeur. And this is me trying to do my best embarrassed look. So this is me trying to signal national historical embarrassment. I don't quite know what that means when you put national historical embarrassment on your face, but whatever it is, that's me trying to do it there and probably failing. Now, those critics of Clive, of the British East India Company and of British involvement in India come in many forms, at least today, but probably not back then. There were only very few people that challenged the rule of the British East India Company from an intellectual perspective back in the 1750s. And here's one of them who you will meet on our project. This is the Scottish philosopher and economist Adam Smith. Smith published his major philosophical work, here it is, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, in 1759, so just 2 years after Clive's victory at the Battle of Plassey claimed the whole of India as a single colonial possession for Britain. I've worked for many years now trying to understand the connections between Smith's philosophical and economic writings. Don't worry, I'm not going to run you through all of the arguments because they are long, they are convoluted, and they are argued over between academics over and over and over and over and over again. However, there is one thing that academic opinion is pretty much united on, and that's the extent to which Smith hated Clive. Adam Smith hated Robert Clive. He hated what he'd done, he hated what he stood for, he hated what he represented, and he hated in particular, I think, how his actions could lead others to think that it was okay for Britain to seize overseas territories as its colonial possessions. Smith was anti-empire in all of its manifestations, and he had a number of different and overlapping critiques of the British East India Company. Let me just run through them for you so you can get a sense of what politics was like in the 1750s when Clive was all the way out in India beating other colonial armies to a pulp. Firstly, Smith had a political critique of the British East India Company, and he focused on this institution. This is Parliament. He focused in particular on the overlapping membership of government and the company's board of directors. There was a frightening frequency with which the person who acted as the board director of the Board of Trade for the British government also acted as a director for the British East India Company. So the person supposedly making the regulations through which the British East India Company was governed was itself a director of the British East India Company. Oh, I wonder what can go wrong in a political structure of that nature. And just to make sure that nothing did go wrong, the British East India Company got lots of MPs in its pay. So it was paying MPs to go and support its interests in parliamentary debates. Smith was appalled by this close connection between the structures of government and the structures of a multinational corporation. He also, however, had economic critiques of the British East India Company, and these came in two main forms. Firstly, here's a famous building that still stands in Kolkata today. These were the offices of the British East India Company in what was formerly Calcutta, now Kolkata. And just like every other Indian city in Kolkata, the British East India Company tried to leave its mark, and tried to leave its mark physically through the building of huge, ornate, grand buildings. Smith thought this was entirely wasteful, and that waste had to be recompensed in other ways. And his economic critique of the British East India Company was that it extracted rent from its consumers by charging a higher price for all the goods that it was shipping back to the UK, so that it could pay for these projects of grandeur, these architectural behemoths that still denote the presence of British Empire within India today. His second economic critique of the British East India Company was about the way that it made its money. It was never a profitable company. The only way that it was able to maintain just the semblance of being profitable was through the trading of gold in the city of London. That the British East India Company paid for its own profit making through its involvement in the gold trade. And the gold trade at that time was being propelled by the new finds of gold within the mines primarily in South America. Brazil alone was responsible for a whopping 40% of new gold products that were developed in that century. And the gold mines in Brazil were worked by slaves that had come from other Portuguese colonies from Africa. The lines look a little bit blurry, but you can maybe see the direction of flow of people from Africa to Brazil mining the gold, creating these new flows of gold that would then go back to Europe and often to the City of London, where being recycled through the credit economy, they cancelled out the losses that the British East India Company were making and made it seem as though it was a profitable company. And on top of these political and economic critiques of the British East India Company, Smith also had very powerful ethical critiques of the British East India Company, primarily because it trampled all over the right to free determination of the people of South Asia, so that it could exploit them, appropriate their possessions, and extract value from their land. This is a right now enshrined by the United Nations, but the British trampled all over the right to free determination. More than that, it set many of the locals up to become the discipliners. That whenever there was a rebellion, whenever there was freedom fighting amongst the local Indian population, often it was others within the local Indian population who were required to exact the most brutal retribution on the people who were seeking to rebel. Smith was also concerned about the way that the British in India used famine as a means of disciplining the local population, the way that the local economy was reorganised to try to extract profits that could then go back to Britain at the expense of meeting the day-to-day needs of the local people. And whenever the crop failed, or whenever a systematic crop failure happened, it wasn't the serving British soldiers or members of the British East India Company that went hungry. It was the local population who were often starved to death. Now then, Smith didn't want to be overly critical of the ordinary British people who were engaged in reproducing British imperial relations on a day-to-day basis like this. It was the broader structure of power that allowed this to happen that he had fixed in his sights. And this does offer me a small amount of comfort as I get to the last of my autobiographical reflections for this morning. Here's a person that will not feature in any history textbook at all. This is Frederick Herbert Long. Frederick Herbert Long was born in 1910 and he died in 1977. Throughout the late 1920s, he served in the 1721st Lancers in the British Imperial Indian Army. The 17th, 21st Lancers, who have this awful insignia of death or glory. Now, Frederick Herbert Long will be unknown to any of you, but I know him really quite well because when I was this height, I used to call him Grandad. This is my Grandad, who was involved in the British Imperial Army in India in the 1920s. Unfortunately, though, that's just about all that I can tell you about that particular story, because I'm overcome by ignorance again. I even went back to Whitchurch at the weekend to talk to my mum to see whether she had any stories that were handed down by my granddad that I would be able to share with you today. And unfortunately, we drew a blank. So I know almost nothing about what he did during his time in India, or how he, as a ordinary serving soldier, was related to these people who look all dressed up. These are the officer class, of course. My granddad was not officer class. He signed up to join the British Army 2 years before he was officially old enough to do so, because he was trying to avoid his abusive and drunken father, my great-grandfather on my mum's side. And so he was 15 years of age when he told them that he was 17, so he could join up. This is a picture of him looking a little bit startled. It might be that he's startled because this is the first time in his life that he'd ever seen a camera being pointed at him. And this is likely to be in 1926 sometime. So here he is, resplendent in his army uniform. And I can look at that one picture of him, but I can only begin to wonder what was going through his head at the time. Did he know when he signed up to become a soldier at the age of 15 that he would end up in India? Did he know that the fact that he was already an apprentice blacksmith, he became the village blacksmith after he came back from the army, did he know that because he was already employed as an apprentice blacksmith, that he would be given the responsibility of looking after the officer class's horses when he got out into India? Did he know how he was reproducing a legacy of British Empire? Did he know that, however inadvertently, he would be following in the footsteps of Robert Clive? I have no idea, and I have no way of ever excavating that knowledge. What I do know, I think I can say for sure, is that he would have had no comprehension at all that I would be standing here nearly 90 years later asking all these questions about him or showing you pictures of him from his time in the army. But these are the sorts of questions about family history that we're interested in asking on the Colonial Hangover project, because they allow us to interject ourselves into these big issues of political history in lots of very interesting ways. I leave you with just one final thought, because it looks as though I've done the usual academics thing and spoken for longer than I was allowed to. Apologies for that. Here's my final thought. There are people who will tell you that the world has moved on. There are people who will tell you that the British Empire is just an artefact of history. There are people that will tell you that it should be left in the past where it belongs. And there are people that will also tell you that there's no need to ask the sorts of questions that animate the Colonial Hangover project. David Cameron is one of those people, Boris Johnson is another one of those people, and Michael Gove is a third. The best piece of evidence that they can muster in support of this position is that there's once again a company trading as the East India Company. Here's its website. You can find it all over the internet, often by searching for New East India Company. But this time, it's an East India Company that's not owned by imperial mercenaries cast from the same cloth as Robert Clive, but by an Indian national. Here he is. His name is Sanjeev Mehta. This would seem to be the ultimate imperial role reversals from the perspective of those who don't want us to focus on the history here. We have an Indian successfully establishing a post-colonial business in London and using the East India Company name as a means of doing that. What could be more fitting for writing the epitaph of the British Empire than this? This isn't the British any longer using the power of a private army to grab South Asian land, but an Indian national using the power of his wallet to buy up some prime central London real estate. The premises are on a street that looks very much like this in Mayfair. And one thing we know from playing Monopoly is that Mayfair is the most expensive space on the board. This is a massive amount of financial power that he's wielding to set up his new East India Company in Mayfair. So does this mean then that there's no colonial hangover of which to speak, and that I'm just talking about purely academic arguments here? Well, here are the pictures of the Colonial Hangover project team. So Shanaz and me without a beard, and Honey, who's down at the front here, and Nikita, who you won't meet today, but hopefully you'll meet at some stage over the project. And we're not so sure. We're not so sure that you can simply consign the British Empire to history because of the development of this new East India Company. We've not visited the restaurant yet that today bears the name of the East India Company, that seems to be its flagship venture, but we have looked at its website, and its website gives us every reason to believe that the legacies of the British Empire are still alive and well. Let me tell you how. Well, firstly, the clientele that it seems to be aiming for would in the olden days have been those officer classes who would have been the main administrators of the British Raj. It's a very white, very middle class clientele that it seems to be aiming for. Secondly, the dining experience it promises is one of exoticism. That come here and you can lose yourself in this exotic experience of a far and distant land. Does this not just invoke parallels with British colonists discovering and taming new and mysterious lands 100 years ago, 200 years ago, nearly 300 years ago? Thirdly, its website suggests that all of the food that it makes is nicely and highly spiced. And more than that, you can go on to its shop, its online shop, and buy these spices for yourself. Does this not invoke the old spice trade routes, which were the reason that the East India companies went to India in the first place? And fourthly, perhaps most damningly, all of the pictures on its website are of its waiting staff are all young British Asian people. Young British Asian people recreating the imperial image of Asians acting as white Britain's servants. There's a clear racial dimension here to the way in which the diner and the server are structured. Now, its website also says that this is, and I quote, "The world's first luxury global brand is back in business, but so it seems are financially profitable invocations of empire." Reasons to be suspicious at the very least. In conclusion, should any of this worry us? As citizens, for you as young citizens, should any of this worry you? Are these reasons to be disturbed? Should we start to bristle when we see the racial hierarchies of empire continuing to cast a shadow over the way in which we live our lives today? These are racial hierarchies from the 18th and 19th century, but they're being commodified and sold as a means of the new East India Company generating its own profitable business model. Is this not something that should worry us in any way? Should we find a critical voice when the Prime Minister tells us the British Empire was disbanded a long time ago and we should all find a way of letting bygones be bygones? Is it as simple as that, though? Is it as simple as that? Or do we have to think about how these historical legacies still imprint themselves in the present? And should we object if the national curriculum in history invites us to consider only a small part of the story by writing out of the official presentation of British history the violence, the brutality and the bloodshed through which the empire was first constructed and then reproduced? Now, those are some of my questions to you. My answers to those questions are not what's important here, it's yours that count. And by the end of the project, hopefully you will have answers to these and a whole host of other important questions that we hope the Colonial Hangover project will bring to you. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you.